At 3:42 in the morning on July the 28th, 1976, a city of 1 million people was asleep. Within 23 seconds, it was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, gone. Flattened to rubble so completely that rescue teams arriving from outside described the scene as a city that had simply ceased to exist. Buildings that had stood for decades collapsed simultaneously. Entire neighborhoods vanished. A major industrial city in northeastern China was erased from the surface of the earth in less time than it takes to read this sentence aloud. The official death toll from the Tangshan earthquake was 242,000 people. Many researchers believe the actual number was significantly higher, possibly approaching 655,000. 250,000 people dead in 23 seconds. But here's what this video is actually about. This is not a story about the power of nature. Nature provided the earthquake. But the death toll, the true scale of that destruction, was not natural. It was manufactured, built piece by piece over years of scientific assumptions, political decisions, and a warning that reached almost everyone except the people who needed to act on it most. What killed 250,000 people in Tangshan was not the earthquake. It was 3 false assumptions, and a silence that nobody broke in time. To understand what went wrong in Tangshan, you need to understand what engineers and geologists believed about that region before July 28, 1976. The word that defined their understanding was aseismic. It means seismically stable, not prone to earthquakes. A region where the geological conditions do not produce significant seismic activity and therefore where structures do not need to be designed with earthquake resistance as a primary engineering consideration. Tangshan had been classified as aseismic. This classification was not arbitrary or carelessly made. It was based on the best available evidence and geological understanding of the time. The historical record of seismic activity in the region was not alarming. The surface geology did not display the obvious warning signs, the surface fault scarps, the fresh geological disruption that typically flag an area as seismically dangerous. So engineers built accordingly. Residential buildings in Tangshan were constructed using the dominant method of the era in China, unreinforced brick masonry. Walls built from bricks laid in mortar without the steel reinforcement frames that seismic engineering relies on to allow structures to flex and absorb ground motion, rather than simply crack and collapse. Unreinforced brick masonry under normal conditions is a perfectly adequate building material. It is solid, durable, and inexpensive. Generations of Chinese urban construction relied on it. Under seismic stress, it is catastrophically fragile. When ground motion hits unreinforced brick masonry at the intensity produced by a major earthquake, the walls crack along mortar lines almost instantly. The structural integrity disappears in seconds. The roof, suddenly unsupported, falls directly downward onto whatever is inside the building. At 3:42 in the morning, virtually every resident of Tangshan was inside a building, asleep in their beds. They never had the chance to run. The buildings that were supposed to protect them became their tombs in less time than a human being can process what is happening and react. This was false assumption number 1. The region was not aseismic. It was a region whose seismic history had not yet been long enough to reveal its true character. But the aseismic misclassification alone does not fully explain the scale of destruction. The second false assumption involves the ground itself. Beneath significant portions of Tangshan's urban area lay something that geologists and engineers now understand as one of the most dangerous conditions a city can be built on during a seismic event. Sandy, water-saturated soil. Under normal conditions, this soil behaves exactly as you would expect. Solid, stable, capable of supporting the weight of buildings without any visible problems. But when seismic waves pass through water-saturated sandy soil, something happens that seems almost physically impossible the first time you encounter it. The soil temporarily loses its solid properties entirely. It begins to behave like a liquid. This process is called liquefaction. The seismic waves essentially agitate the water between the sand particles to the point where the sand grains can no longer maintain contact with each other. The solid matrix that gives the soil its load-bearing capacity dissolves. And in that moment, anything resting on top of that soil, including the foundations of buildings, loses its stable base. Structures do not just shake during liquefaction. They sink, they tilt, they shift laterally. Foundations that were entirely adequate under normal conditions suddenly have nothing solid to grip. The combined effect of unreinforced brick masonry buildings sitting on soil prone to liquefaction, being struck by significant seismic forces, produced a destruction rate in Tangshan that would have been extraordinary even if only one of these factors had been present. With all 3 interacting simultaneously, the result was near total collapse across enormous portions of the city. But we have not yet addressed false assumption number 3. And this one is perhaps the most consequential of all. Beneath Tangshan, hidden from the geological surveys that had classified the region as aseismic, ran a major fault line. Unknown, unmapped. completely absent from every geological model that had informed the decision to classify this region as stable and safe for unreinforced construction. The fault that ruptured on July the 28th, 1976, was not a small or peripheral feature of the regional geology. It was a major structural element of the underground rock system beneath the city. When it moved, it released energy equivalent to approximately 400 Hiroshima atomic bombs. That energy, traveling upward through the water-saturated sandy soil, striking unreinforced brick buildings at 3:42 in the morning, produced 23 seconds of destruction that erased a city. 3 false assumptions: an unknown fault, dangerous soil conditions, and buildings never designed to survive what the ground beneath them was capable of doing. But here is what transforms this from tragedy into something more disturbing. Someone had warned them. In the weeks before July 28th, unusual things had been happening in and around Tangshan that some observers were paying close attention to. While water was changing levels erratically, a phenomenon sometimes associated with stress changes in underground rock formations before seismic events, animals were behaving strangely. There were reports of unusual light phenomena in the sky, which modern researchers now understand may be related to electromagnetic effects produced by stresses building in underground rock. There were scientists and observers in China who were taking these signals seriously and making predictions. The Chinese earthquake prediction program, which had achieved a notable success the previous year with a prediction that preceded the Haiqing earthquake in February 1975, was actively monitoring seismic conditions across the region. A warning was issued, signals were observed, predictions were made, and almost everywhere, that information did not translate into action. Almost everywhere. Qinglong. This is the name that should appear in every engineering textbook, every emergency management training program, every course on disaster risk communication ever taught. Qinglong County was located approximately 115 kilometers from the epicenter of the Tangshan earthquake. Close enough that the ground motion it experienced was substantial. Close enough that without intervention, the damage to its buildings and the casualties among its population would have followed the same devastating pattern seen across the region. But Qinglong had something that Tangshan did not have: an official who took the warning seriously and acted on it. When the seismic warning information reached Qinglong, the local official responsible for civil defense did not file it away, did not wait for higher confirmation, did not defer to the official regional classification of the area as low risk. He briefed the population. He implemented civil defense measures. He communicated the risk clearly and organized a response that prepared people to react if the earthquake came. The earthquake came. Qinglong County recorded 0 deaths. 0. In a region where hundreds of thousands of people died, in an area close enough to the epicenter that the ground motion was significant. 0 deaths, because one official took a scientific warning seriously enough to act on it before the event rather than after. This single fact dismantles any argument that the Tangshan catastrophe was inevitable. It was not a force of nature that no human action could have mitigated. It was a preventable mass casualty event that became one of the deadliest earthquakes in recorded human history because a warning was issued and not acted upon at scale. The arithmetic is unbearable. If the same measures implemented in Qinglong had been implemented in Tangshan, the death toll could have been reduced by an enormous proportion. Not eliminated entirely, because buildings would still have collapsed. But people who knew to be outdoors, who knew to be away from unreinforced masonry walls, who were psychologically prepared to react immediately rather than awakening in confusion beneath falling rubble, had dramatically better survival odds than people who received no warning at all. 250,000 people. And a 115-kilometer distance between a warning that saved everyone and a warning that reached almost no one in time to act. But the failures did not end when the shaking stopped. What happened in the aftermath of the Tangshan earthquake added a political dimension to the human failure that had already produced catastrophic casualties. China in 1976 was operating under a doctrine of self-reliance that was both a genuine philosophical position and a deeply embedded political identity. The Chinese government under Mao Zedong had built much of its international legitimacy on the principle of national independence, of solving Chinese problems with Chinese resources, of rejecting foreign assistance as an implicit acknowledgement of weakness or inadequacy. When the earthquake struck and the international community offered assistance, medical teams, rescue equipment, experienced search and rescue personnel, China refused everything. Every offer turned down. The official position was that China would manage the disaster through its own resources and the mobilization of its own people. What that decision meant in practice was that in the critical hours and days immediately following the earthquake, while tens of thousands of survivors were trapped alive beneath rubble waiting for rescue, the resources and expertise that might have reached them did not arrive. The window for rescuing survivors trapped under collapsed buildings is finite. It closes over time as dehydration, injury, and exposure take their toll. International urban search and rescue teams with specialized equipment and training can operate in that window in ways that overwhelmed local responders, dealing with catastrophic damage across an entire city simultaneously, simply cannot replicate at the necessary scale. The refusal of international aid was not a neutral administrative decision with no consequences. It was a choice made within a political and ideological framework that prioritized doctrine over the lives of people who were still alive under the rubble when that choice was made. This is not a judgment unique to China or to this political system. History offers numerous examples of political or ideological frameworks producing decisions that prioritize symbolic or doctrinal concerns over straightforward humanitarian arithmetic. The specific identity of the ideology changes. The underlying dynamic in which systems built to serve people end up making decisions that cost those people their lives in service of abstract principles recurs across many contexts and many political traditions. But in Tangshan, in the summer of 1976, the arithmetic was particularly stark. Thousands of people still alive, help available from outside, a doctrine that said no. The Tangshan earthquake contributed to a broader political crisis in China that culminated just weeks later in the death of Mao Zedong and the subsequent political transformation that ultimately brought reformers to power and changed the direction of Chinese governance. Whether the earthquake directly influenced this sequence of events is historically debated, but the symbolic weight of a catastrophe so vast occurring in the final months of an era was not lost on the Chinese public or the political figures navigating that transition. So what does Tangshan ultimately teach us? It teaches us that the designation of a region as safe, when that designation rests on incomplete geological data, can produce building practices that transform a survivable earthquake into a mass casualty event. It teaches us that soil conditions invisible to surface observation can multiply the destructive power of ground motion in ways that structural designers, working from incomplete information, cannot anticipate or design against. It teaches us that a warning, even an accurate and timely warning, accomplishes nothing if it does not translate into action. Qinglong did not survive because its buildings were stronger. Qinglong survived because its warning translated into behavior change before the event. The gap between the fate of Qinglong and the fate of Tangshan is the gap between communication that produces action and communication that does not. And it raises the question that remains the hardest one to answer in disaster risk management even today. What do we do when a prediction has been made, but no one listens? Scientists today have more sophisticated tools than existed in 1976. Geological mapping has improved enormously. Seismic hazard assessment has matured into a far more nuanced and capable field. Building codes in seismically active regions have been transformed by decades of painful experience, studying exactly what happened in earthquakes like Tangshan. But the human problem, the gap between knowing and acting, between issuing a warning and translating that warning into the decisions and behaviors that save lives, remains as challenging as it has ever been. Somewhere in the world right now, there is a geological hazard that is not fully understood. There is a building stock constructed on assumptions that will prove incorrect when the ground finally moves. There is a warning that has been issued, filed, and not acted upon. Tangshan cannot be undone. 250,000 people cannot be brought back. But the question those 250,000 people leave behind is one that every scientist, every engineer, every emergency manager, and every political official responsible for public safety carries a responsibility to answer. When the warning comes, what do you do with it?